a reminder to everybody to keep asking questions and make sure that you keep using the chat function on the right-hand side of your screen. I'm now going to just introduce our final session of the day. It is the ISO Roundtable with Namond Prevost, Project Management Officer at Nexo Standards, and someone who's been involved in the organisation since its inception. He will moderate the session, which asks the question, how ISO 20022 can help the payments acceptance community go beyond interoperability. Namond, over to you.
Hello and welcome to this roundtable. Our ISO 20022 can help the payment acceptance work go beyond interoperability. As said by Sarah, my name is Normand Prevost. I'm PMO at Nexo Standard, and I'll be the moderator for this session today. I have the pleasure to have with me what we could consider the ISO 20022 powerhouse, Mr. Patrice Herzog, who's chair of the TC68 SC9, Mr. Mike Gay, convener of the ISO 20022 Registration Management Group, Ms. Charlie Clark, and Mr. Neil Buchan, Vice Convener of the ISO 20022 Payment Standard Evaluation Group, and Mr. William Van Oberger, Convener of the ISO 20022 Cards Related Financial Retail Services Standard Evaluation Group. Hello, everyone. So, dear panelists, I thought maybe to set the tone and help everyone better understand what ISO 20022 is about, that we could maybe watch a quick video that was produced by ISO 20022. So let's watch that video, please.
When people communicate, they often get confused and end up misunderstanding each other. Take the word football, for instance. It might mean one thing to an American and something entirely different to a Brit. Well, it's no different in the business world, where the stakes are way higher. Here, a simple misunderstanding can lead to disastrous consequences. So how do you improve communication, make sense of different meanings, standards, and formats, and get everyone in the financial sector on the same page? Easy. By using ISO 20022. The international standard that's designed to simplify global business communication. You see, ISO 20022 solves communication confusion. How? Well, it offers a global dictionary of common language that everyone can understand, so information can be processed and exchanged worldwide, clearly and consistently, making it easier than ever to communicate financial information between people and systems. What's more, ISO 20022 is a free and open standard, which means that anyone, anywhere can add their 2 cents to the dictionary to help write and build solid business standards right across the globe. Not only does ISO 20022 streamline communication for payments, securities, funds, foreign exchange trading, and credit card sectors, it also reduces risk, big time. ISO 20022, because common understanding leads to effective communication and makes doing business a whole lot easier. To learn more about ISO 20022, visit one of these websites.
So thanks. As we saw in this short video, ISO 20022 is a very powerful methodology that addresses the harmonization and standardization of messages exchanges in the financial industry and also combine many business domains. And maybe my first question will be to Patrice and Mike, as not everyone might be that familiar with the ISO organization and where ISO 2022 fit within it. Could you maybe explain how the structure is organized?
So, yes, I will start with explaining ISO world. So TC68 is the committee in charge of financial services, and TC68 has set up 3 subcommittees, one addressing security for financial services, the second one for what we call data reference, for example, currency codes or BIC or IBANs, and the third one, SC9, is about information exchange. This committee is driven by their members, which are the national standardization bodies and liaisons. The main purpose of the committee is the development and management of standards within its portfolio. One of them is ISO 20022. It is a multi-part international standard. And what is specific also to the role of the committee is the oversight of what we call the registration authority, which we'll explain later, and also specifically a submitter of ISO 20022 messages, especially for what we call acquire to issuer card messages. And why? Because the SC9 also handle ISO 8583. And the purpose of being the submitter for these messages, ISO 20022 Etica, is to ensure consistency between the two standards. So in terms of interoperability, we can easily go from one to the other. What is not within the ISO family that is really key for ISO 20022 is all the registration process. And it will be explained more later on, but there is the registration authority handling the repository with all the data definitions, the messages, business processes, and so on, and all what is about the registration management group, essentially the evaluation of the messages and more, and which also is bringing together the community of users. And Mike will explain more the details of what here is in green, all about the registration of ISO 20022. I let Mike to complement because he's the expert that has a new convener of ISO 20022 RMG.
Well, thank you for the kind introduction, Patrice. I think the expert part was really stolen by the video. But just to reiterate what registration is, the video mentioned about the methodology, which is what ISO 20022 is. And registration is really about registering into what was called a dictionary, but actually it's a repository which houses ISO 20022 compliant business models, as well as message models, and also the physical messages themselves. The registration process is about going through a development and validation process, and then registering those artifacts into the repository and making those available to the public. And there are these various bodies in the slide that get involved, which we will go into detail. But the registration management group is the group that I'm currently chairing. It has 39 member communities as participants, where Nexo is one of the 39 and one of the key contributors in developing ISO 20022 messages. The standards evaluation groups, which will be elaborated later, is really a group of business experts, which consist of RMG members as well as experts in the community, where their key function is to ensure that the proposed message is really usable for the business processes or the business purposes. There are other groups, such as the technical support group, who provide the technical expertise to navigate through the various technologies available. But those are really the key registration bodies where the registration authority, which under contract with the ISO organization, performs the actual operations of the registration and really ensures that the database or actually the repository is consistent and has integrity all along. So that is the brief introduction of the bodies involved.
Thank you, Mike and Patrice. So as we could see here, from a high-level point of view, the governance of ISO and ISO 20020 is working very well together. As we have you, Mike, and some of the conveners on the panel today, I thought maybe we could go a bit deeper on the process of submitting and maybe better understanding later on how the interoperability will play. So maybe I could start with you, Mike.
Right, fine. And so These slides are available at ISO20022.org, which is really the entrance to the repository as well. And they are available free to download, and it has also speaking notes attached to it, so anybody can read. And this is really just to show that there is a rigid process that makes the final artifact, which is the message, compliant to the certain ISO standards. The process starts with a submitting organization, which has an idea to automate certain business processes, bundling together some data elements into a message and being able to make it sort of exchanged across the participants in the market. The submitting organization does not have to be an RMG member. It really reflects the need of the community, and it goes through an approval process where the RMG checks whether the new business proposal is indeed a new process, and it's not fragmenting the existing repository by introducing two messages into one process. So that kind of integrity check at the beginning is done by the RMG, and then it goes into the development process, and the standards evaluation group performs a key role to validate whether the proposed message is viable for use for the businesses in question. And then it gets registered by the registration authority and goes into the repository as shown in the right-hand side. There's another process, which I believe there's another slide, which talks to an annual maintenance cycle where, this is how we started, where we have an annual maintenance cycle where we accept a change request throughout the year, but it gets processed in one cycle. And you can see that the standards evaluation groups, the submitting organization come into play because the initial submitting organization becomes the owner of the message. And so they get involved. The submitter of the change request is somebody else in the community, and development takes place, business validation takes place, and then it goes live at a certain point in time of the year. And obviously, there are fast track maintenance processes, emergency maintenance processes. So it doesn't mean that everybody has to wait for a whole year to do something. But this is the baseline, which we are also trying to improve because we do understand that the cards and the payments acceptance industry has far more, let's say, agile needs. And we're really working with the registration authority to explore how this process could be further accelerated. So that's a brief overview of the registration process.
Perfect. Thank you, Mike. Charlie, I was to ask you maybe how would that apply specifically for one of the standard evaluation group, but I think Mark has covered it a bit. Unless you have something to add to this, that would be very specific, explaining maybe to the audience how the process is impacting you or impacting the group you're leading. Any idea, any thoughts you want to add on this?
Yeah, I mean, I think Mike explained it succinctly, and as in his mention of the video as well, it was a very good example of how everything works with ISO. The SEGs, the Standards Evaluation Group, are like an integral part of the process, as you could see in that last slide, especially. If you go into the ISO20022.org website today, it talks about industry experts being part of that, business process. So, my expertise, or at least my experience, has been in the payments domain, but I would imagine that the works of all of the different SEGs are very similar, or if not the same. And maybe William can jump in if there are any nuances I've missed. But the SEG consists of experts in the global community of ISO 20022 users. The users include private organizations, corporate members, financial institutions, market infrastructures, clearing houses, and more. And they all bring those expertise and those perspectives into how we create and organize and accommodate in the messages to make sure that they are usable for their own business processes as well as any other. So that part is that standardization and consistency and diligence in the work that we do allows for the hurdle that we need to go into for interoperability. Because when we talk about interoperability, we could be talking global interoperability here, and obviously there is more to look at when we want to speak globally, but working on the messages, that communication, that first business communication, the messages are the first hurdle that we have to get through to make sure that we're all speaking that same language, that, you know, the football is the same to everybody, and we're not using different words, we're not using different languages. So that's the key importance that the payment segs or the different segs bring to the process. In terms, obviously, the how changes are made, and Mike went through it, and truly anyone can make a change. As the video said, anyone anywhere can put their 2 cents into to make a change to the dictionary. And then the SEGs will now take a review and make their own evaluate the usability of the messages. In terms of where there's a more complex decisions to be made, we have actually separated into little mini task forces where volunteers from communities who have a vested interest in the change that is being investigated will come together and actually do a deeper dive on the question at hand to come to a conclusion before bringing that back to the SEG, in our case the payment SEG, so that we can come to an agreement and whether approve or reject the request as needed. So again, I would just like to say that the diligence and the dedication in this ensures that interoperability, in addition to bringing that diverseness of business and other communities and countries, and bringing all of those interests into making sure that the messages are usable and manageable for exchange.
Thank you, Charlie. And touching on the interoperability, as we saw, or as we could understand, it seems like there's a different business domains, potentially different business SEG. All might be working in silo, maybe not. My next question to the panelists would be, how is this, from more tactical point of view, the interoperability has been looked at? Because everyone might have a different way of understanding what interoperability could mean. So from an ISO 20022 point of view, how is that possible? I don't know. Neil, maybe any thoughts on this that you could share with us?
Sure. Thank you, Norman. So maybe we should touch a little bit from an interoperability perspective on the data dictionary itself. So obviously Mike alluded to this a little bit earlier. So typically, first of all, we should talk, I suppose, starting off with, let's refer to it as the ISO data repository. So that's made up of 2 parts, effectively. You've got the data dictionary I just mentioned, but also, most importantly, you've also got the business process that sits behind it. So really a bit of a description of how that model and that data is actually used to ensure we've got a common understanding, effectively, for the industry. On the data itself, when we talk about the data dictionary, obviously, what does that actually explain to us? Well, one, it describes the data name. So what exactly is that data? It has a description against that data of how you might understand it. It's also got the types of characteristics that make up that data. So what does that mean? You know, the minimum amount of length, the maximum amount of length, the construct of that data. Is it a code? Has it a pattern associated to it? Perhaps it's alphanumeric, those sorts of combinations. All of which you can, of course, again, we're plugging it quite a bit in this session, but if you look on ISO 20022.org, you can interrogate that data in the online repository, and of course you can also see where it's used across a variety of different business domains. So perhaps coming back to the point that you kind of alluded to as far as the interoperability piece, as a well-defined open standard with strong governance that Charlie just spoke about. Obviously, from the data model itself, when we look at the implementation, of course, that from an industry perspective can be in back offices, in applications. That, of course, can be in middleware. Of course, integrating with a variety of different other standards in the industry, but also, as quite commonly we associate with ISO 20022, that's obviously the exchange between the counterparts. So in that sense, we've got some real strong reasons from an industry perspective why that's quite important. And most sensibly, when we look at it from a variety of different business areas, in ISO we term those as domains effectively. We traditionally, as we saw in the video, and again Charlie referred to, it's a common trait. In the industry, we refer to things, even in different business domains, in different ways, right? You know, it can be exactly the same thing, but we talk about it in a variety of different ways. Is it a bank? Is it a beneficiary bank? Is it an agent using ISO terms? So we create these interoperability challenges a little bit for ourselves, but equally traditionally in the different domains, we didn't always have the same data standard to those different pieces, which further created barriers and obstacles for ourselves. You know, if we had perhaps as an example, an address associated to a particular party, obviously, unless those are the same, then that's a challenge. However, with ISO 20022, the data model is effectively shared across those business domains. So if we just took one example, if we started to look at an agent that might be involved with a settlement of a security transaction, but we then talk about that coming through to the settlement of that into a payments world, where, you know, my background, we're talking the same thing. That same data repository can be shared across those parties. Now, with that, obviously, maybe this is where William wants to chime in. I know a lot of interoperability goes on from a card perspective, and maybe he's got some better examples than me.
Yeah, I was to ask, and I think maybe that could be a good segue to Williams or other panelists. Is there any other concrete examples that we could share that the audience would better understand maybe how this interoperability is made possible with the use of the ISO 20022?
Yeah, if we take the example of and thank you for permitting me to to present this. But for the CardSec, we have the chance to have, for instance, two main submitting organizations, so contributors, which is Nexo first, and Nexo is contributing a lot to the submission of not only messages but also ensure the maintenance of those messages. And we have, on the other hand, we have also Attica, which is an ISO group which reports to Patrick SC9. And those different subgroup, I would say, of the CardSec, or two main contributors, works in a complementary way, in the fact that we are addressing two different subdomains. The card acceptance domain, which is basically the relationship between the acceptor, so the merchant, and the bank of the merchant on one side, and Attica, which is basically addressing the relationship between the bank of that merchant and the bank of the cardholder. So we see concrete examples where we have two complementary set of standards, but that's within a given domain, which is the card domain. But we will see more and more in the future some additional link bridges, I would call, with other SEC, and we spoke and Charlie presented the payment SEC, and we see more and more very close link with that payment SEC. Just to give you an example, some years ago there was an idea of piggybacking some card details upon settlement messages, which occur today for card and other payment instruments. It was the SEPA card clearing. So it was a concrete example of elements which have been designed and developed in the domain of cards to be piggybacked on something which was essentially dealt with within the payment sec. So as you see, there are concrete contribution based on, and that's also the beauty of ISO 20022, based on the same elements, data elements become part of the data repository that we already addressed. So we are reusing the same components as much as possible. And of course, it's a major advantage, a major benefit of ISO 20022 in allowing that reuse of those elements. We see today more and more cross-reference between the card and also the payments in terms of settlement. In France, for instance, we have STET, which is using ISO 20022 messages. And if you look at what Nexo is doing, what Attica is doing, well, you can see that we can cover the whole value chain of payments and of messages, which are all ISO 20022 compliant ones. That's some example, but there are other examples with tomorrow, not only what we know as the settlement in the pull mode, which is used by the card, but in the push mode with SCT ints, we can use on one side authorization and financial presentment messages, which are card-based messages, and which end up in a settlement which is essentially used for other types of payments. And furthermore, if we look further, we could also think strong ties with the Forex sec, with also other type of sec, the security secs, for instance, for the Forex, which address all what is related to working with different currencies. We see that we can make and we can have strong link with that sec as well. And also with the securities one, well, it seems strange, but I saw recently in a Belgian newspaper that, a Belgian bank was considering offering some security services on top of a card-based payment. Basically, the idea was to offer a micro investing service where you can use your spare change on a card transaction, and you can use that by investing in stocks, for instance, of course, for very small amounts, but all the transaction could be rounded to the upper euro, for instance, and the delta, the difference could be invested in some stocks. So you see, we will see more and more in the future that kind of examples where the different secs will be involved.
Thanks, William. I think those were great examples as we see the ecosystem working together and trying to address the market needs and benefiting from the ISO approach. My next question will be to Patrice. To that end, there's a lot of discussion around interoperability in Europe, but also globally. How is ISO currently addressing it, or what ISO is kind of doing about it? Could you share some of your the thoughts on that aspect, Patrice?
Yes. So first, when thinking about interoperability at ISO level, I just had a look at the different standards, numerous standards where interoperability is defined. I just kept two of them, interestingly. I think one is more IT oriented. So interoperability defined as ability of two or more systems or applications to exchange information and to mutually use the information that has been exchanged. That's basically interoperability. But I also saw another one, which is talking about payment interoperability. And payment interoperability there is defined as acceptance of payment application at the merchant point of sales, whatever the payment application issuer is, and whatever the merchant acquirer is. Acquire meaning, yes, in terms of payments, for card it's clear, for payments it's the payment processor for the merchant, or the merchant bank. So interestingly, there are many different definitions, but for ISO, interoperability is really key, because when we are talking about standards is, as you know, to facilitate trade, and to facilitate trade, you have standards, and to ensure the use of the standards, you need some kind of interoperability. So that's really key for ISO. And what is really interesting, and I just want to mention something that is currently really key for ISO, for SC9, and also for ISO 20022, is because we see that in more and more cases, the situation where we have a real time, we have new actors, new processes with direct connection to the different players. We are entering to a new world, and it was already discussed in depth during this conference, talking about APIs. So APIs is really important for ISO, and also for ISO 20022. So in terms of APIs, SC9 has developed a technical specification which addresses, which is called the web-based API in financial services. And this technical specifications includes use cases as a use case ISO 20022 web services. And I think it's really important because we have in ISO 20022 a repository with the data definitions when anyone is thinking about developing APIs, why not using what is already defined? So it's really important to be able for ISO 20022 to include new syntaxes, and that's especially the syntax which is mainly used for APIs is JSON, and that's possible. And we are even working on to specify and to into ISO 20022 the way to transform easily the repository in a new syntax like JSON, and also the different protocols that are used. And I think that will be more discussed later on. But within ISO 20022, all what is around API resources have been taken into consideration by the RMG and the RA. That's something that is really key for the success, and also for to ensure interoperability between what is currently being massively deployed as messaging standards and the new way to exchange information, which is more and more using APIs. So we need to ensure consistency between the data that are exchanged, and that's really ISO 20022 is really well positioned for this.
Thanks, Patrice. And yes, you touched on the API aspect. If not misleading, the payment seg through the API working group is currently working on a registration process that would help those submitting organizations willing to develop based on the API approach, providing them the governance. So maybe Charlie, Neil, could you give us an update on where you guys stand with the API registration, resource registration process, please?
Sure, no problem. So maybe quickly as a little bit of background. So where did this come from? What myself and Charlie and Peter as the main convener of the PaySeg were starting to see in the PaySeg was a number of change requests that were coming into the data repository of ISO in the payments domain explicitly, which really were driven from the API world. A number of organizations around the world were really exploring and using ISO 20022 data within their APIs, and of course they were evolving with their business needs to describe those business data elements, which was kind of where the API work group emerged from underneath the PaySeg. Myself and Charlie convened that group, and very early on in the discussions, we recognise some of the industry challenges were really of how we perhaps formalise that repository. We talked a little bit, or I talked a little bit earlier about we've already got a well-defined model, which is predominantly why people in the API world enjoy using ISO 20022. But in the same way, it's a slight permutation on what we've got in the messaging world. We tend to refer to the message data as messaging components. In the ISO world, we talk about the resources that the APIs might use, and to a degree, as explained a moment ago, to a degree that those are being used in slight different permutations, partly because of the syntax. JSON obviously doesn't have the type of nesting we have in an XML message, which is one of the drivers. But in essence, what we really saw is a move from the API industry to formalize a process. So we've actually got a API resource repository that API implementers can then use within their API contracts. And it's an important point, which what we should stress here is just the API resources. It's not the actual contracts themselves that we're looking. We effectively came up with a proposal to standardize effectively and implement the process. So in essence, myself and Charlie with the API work group, we formalized the proposal, we described the problem statement, why ISO could really help the industry in this space. And we've submitted a proposal to the RMG, to Mike and the fellow RMG members, and said, look, this is how we could actually solve an industry problem. And effectively, the RMG came back and felt that the work group had done a great job, effectively, at describing it, and really asked us to take that further with a proof of concept, but expanding that out wider than the PaySeg. We invited all the other segs to participate to make sure we were being inclusive to the API needs, and really mature that process, which we've done. We've carried out a proof of concept. In principle, it's worked very well. We've learned some lessons. We've tweaked our proposal, and we're now really looking forward to take that forward into a more formal implementation that the industry can learn to use effectively.
Perfect.
So maybe
Thanks,
with that,
Neil.
Charlie, I've rambled on for a little while. Is there anything perhaps I've missed? Keep me honest.
No, that's perfect. I mean, I think the only thing I would suggest mention though is that all of this work is being done by volunteers, and it's thanks to the dedication of those volunteers that we get to make this kind of progress. So yeah,
Totally agree.
Yeah, you're right, Charlie. That's the beauty of working with ISO and ISO submitting organizations. You touched briefly on it, Neil, about the implementation. Is there? So looks like some of the pieces seems to be in place, or at least the ground is taking place. Would that mean and that's an open question to the panelists, would that mean for implementers that they will have to, if they want to reach out this interoperability, they would have to start over again and build kind of a new, or how could they benefit from what already exists and leverage that's kind of a cross-function approach? Anyone could share some thoughts on this?
So maybe I can start.
Or
go for it, Mike,
please.
Well, so I'll just start, but I think Neil summarized the approach in a way that the industry is, the RMG, the SEGs are trying to solve for the practical issues that the user has. So probably historically, there were some concerns that when people talked about ISO 20022, some people got scared and said, oh, do we have to change the ISO 20022? We're not going to change the card terminals to ISO 20022. And there was a lot of sort of misunderstanding about what the ISO 20022 was. But I think by showing real use cases, we're trying to change the dialogue that this is not like a provider trying to sell you interoperability, but the users driving the change and introducing new processes, and trying to alleviate the historical fear and making sure that interoperability works for the user that has the background needs to integrate more data in the background, and not about changing the syntax that they have to face to the external world. So user-driven changes, interoperability, and I think all the standardization efforts that we make available in the repository helps that interoperability. So just as a starter.
Thanks. Neil, something you want to add?
No, I totally agree with Mike. Again, a lot of this for me is about the practicality. We've talked about the actual how we should think about the submission process right the way down to the end product, which effectively is the data that, of course, then's only powerful if we can work with the different API tools that effectively then use that set of data to create their API contracts.
Thank you. So that would almost lead me to kind of our conclusion before we go for the Q&A. Looks like the interoperability seems to be key. Market is really requesting it, and we are seeing that both from an ISO point of view or under the ISO 20022 global registration participants, this is also being addressed. For sure, Nexo as an active submitting organization, we are working on it, but as we are expanding our scope beyond cards, interoperability will be a key element for us in the future of our specs and protocol. And I'm sure Nexo will be delivering on what the market is kind of requiring or what the recommendation would be. I would like to thank you all for participating. And my first question to you would be, as we, Nexo is expanding our scope, how could Nexo better benefit and all the ecosystem better benefit from this interoperability and making sure that all the elements would be incorporated into, and as we have our DNA is more on the payment acceptance point of view. And as mentioned earlier by William, we are making sure that working with our colleagues from other submitting organizations, we could make sure that those messages could apply from end-to-end process. But is there any cues or any input from the panelists on how we could better benefit from all of this?
I think, if I may, Normand, I think there are a lot of ISO 20022 messages that have been already designed today, and which may surely address maybe the ambition of Nexo to look beyond the card model. If you enter into the space of the payments into a larger space than just the card, you will see that, well, just for payments, there are a lot of different messages which could certainly convey your requirements. And as it was said before, we look forward the emergence of ISO 20022 APIs in the future, which for sure will help Nexo. For instance, since we know that POS is working, for instance, with a cash register machine or an application of a cash register machine, we can imagine that there will be a lot of developments around APIs, ISO 20022 APIs with this, or maybe also with merchants, with the acquirers as well. So we can see that if you make an inventory and assessment of what ISO 20022 is already offering today, you will see that certainly a lot of those messages may convey needs.
Corinne? Thank you, William. Might be a tough question, but I thought I'll ask it again. Still, ISO 2022 seems to, some people are saying it's an old message been here for more than 15 years. So how would you react to that? Are we in line with ISO 2022? Are we in line with what the market is really needing and to ease that kind of interoperability that the market is requesting?
I think maybe it's important to know that in the process of ISO process, so the standard when it is published, there is a permanent revision regularly. The standard is assessed and maybe revised. That's currently the case for ISO 20022. So there was a periodical review, and based on this review, many comments were made and improvements, or especially, for example, as I told earlier, the JSON aspect and so on would be included, worked on, and there will be a working group set up these coming weeks to work on the new version of ISO 20022. So that means that the standard by itself is always evolving, and when there are specific needs on the standard itself, it is handled by ISO. That's one part. The second part, of course, is the maintenance of the messages and other all what is on the repository. Well, you have seen there is this yearly life cycle for the maintenance, which is already there. So it's not a static situation, but at the same time, what is also important is that we don't go into a permanent change, because any change, especially because it's a standard that is more and more used everywhere globally, any change will have an impact on all the actors. So it's important that the implementation is following the change made to the standards. And it's really key. And we have seen in the past that it's really difficult to implement and to be sure that it is done everywhere in a particular domain. So that's really key. And also what is important, and I think it's one of the beauty of ISO 20022, is the integration of new standards, especially ISO standard. I give some examples. You have a new standard to define, for example, an identifier. In ISO 20022, this identifier will be a new data type. So to ensure that every messages or every messages can use in a really standard way this new identifier. For example, we have the LEI, which is a legal entity identifier. It has been set up mainly for the purpose of in the securities world, but may also be used in the card world to identify, for example, an acceptor or a merchant. But then this is already defined and can be easily implemented without any new definitions. And that's really important. So the reuse of what has been done for one domain can be done to another. So there is a lot of dynamics around this standard. That's why we have this registration authority and all this registration management, because it's in permanent move.
Perfect. Thanks, Patrice, for those clarification. Yeah, please, Mike.
Sorry, maybe I could add, because the question was intriguing, where you sort of implied that ISO 20022 could already be legacy. And I think those perceptions need to be dealt with, in a sense that historically there was some misunderstanding that ISO 20022, oh, that's XML. Oh, those are largely bank-based payments and settlements. But I think if you recall the video, which did a great message for us, is that ISO 20022 is a methodology. And I believe that the technology behind that methodology is very solid, that it provides the right modeling. It does take a layering approach, but it provides the consistency across many other standards. So probably the opportunity from an RMG perspective is to make sure that the methodology is communicated well, and also the usage of ISO 20022 in the way that it allows for further automation from the user, and also that the real opportunity is not on the message itself, but what the user does with the data itself, that's the real opportunity. And once we are able to communicate that there are those opportunities, we always rely on submitters and the community to submit change requests and all that. So probably one opportunity for the RMGs is to really reach out to the wider community to advocate for the use of the ISO 20022. So interesting question. Hopefully we can answer that better in the future.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Let me bounce back on this, because you're right. We're talking a lot about the submitting organization, the message that are available, but what about implementation or how people are using cross functions messages? How could we maybe, and that's an open question again for the panel, how could we as a group or as an ecosystem maybe better promote what each other are doing and making sure that we could benefit from what, as Petra said, what exists and how could we leverage that?
So just to take a first stab, it's really trying to communicate that it's not about trying to change what you do today, but trying to preserve what you do today, but help you better integrate in the background of the data needs yourself and also the data needs with your clients. Because I think there's a misunderstanding that when people talk about adoption or migration, it creates the wrong impression that you have to change what you do today. But what we're trying to do in terms of the interoperability is that we want to provide tools and methods that really help further the user integrate their data with something else that they have in the background. So let me start on that and others can chime in.
Thank you. Does anyone have something to add?
I was going to quickly add, I mean, just on particularly on the cross-domain exchanges perspective, I mean, already within the ISO 20022 organization of the SECs, we already quite frequently work cross-domain. There's a number of change requests that come in, whether or not these are new business justifications or even changes to our existing messages, where these are copied to a number of the SECs to provide input. And in recent examples, even when we've talked about statements and cash management within the PaySeg, we've had to reach out to the card sec with William and his experts in the card sec, really to get a better understanding where we've had change requests related to statements or the card industry looking to use certain aspects of statements. So as I say, already I think we've got a very good relationship across domains, and I think as Mike alluded to, I think that will continue to remain as the ISO standard continues to evolve and meet the industry need.
Thank you, Neil. And that leads me to think that it would be important for submitting organization, but all the participants to get involved and be involved, as we want to make sure that those will occur. So I want to thank you all for this very grateful exchange we had today. And hoping to that our road would cross again as we are participating in this. So I'll leave the floor to Sarah.
Thank you, Naman. This and everybody for taking part in that panel today. We really appreciate it. And this brings us to the end of today's session. I think Mark Levinson gave us many insights today into the challenges of standardization, but one element that struck a chord with me is hesitancy, that stakeholders don't want to take the risk of investing at the wrong time. They're asking the question, is it the right time to act? And I think what is clear in Nexo's case is the answer is yes, the time is now. Our presenters today have clearly referenced the changing landscape, the need to be agile, innovative, in the session just now about speaking the same language, and can we create usable messages that can then adapt to these market and technology driven changes. I think something else that was really clear in everyone's presentation is that, you know, everyone has a voice. Representation from all players is key, and implementation by a range of players is also key. So if you aren't an EXO member, please join us. We want to hear what you have to say, what your challenges are, opportunities, and use all these experts and skill set together to actually create a very robust ecosystem that can adapt to technology advances and also what consumers are wanting.